Hey guys, tonight we're heading north, really far north. Picture the cold winds brushing against wooden walls, the flicker of firelight bouncing off iron blades, and the distant creak of ships anchored in a frozen bay. Welcome to your life as a Viking Berserker, the roughest, wildest, and probably most misunderstood group of warriors to ever walk the medieval world. Now, before we get lost in the cliches, no, Berserkers weren't magical shapeshifters or half-bear creatures. Those are later exaggerations, born from poets who liked drama. The real men were human, brutal, yes, fearless, mostly, but also just tired, hungry, and a little too comfortable with chaos. They lived in a time when honor wasn't a word, it was a survival skill. Imagine waking up before dawn in a smoky longhouse. The air smells of pine, ash, and sweat. You've got a fur blanket over your shoulders, but it's not warm enough, because nothing ever really is. Outside, frost glistens on the grass, and the sea fog rolls in, silent and heavy. You step out barefoot, because boots are for the weak, and the ground bites at your skin like a warning. Today might be another raid day, or a training day, or maybe just another day pretending you don't care if tomorrow comes. Being a berserker wasn't about being constantly angry, it was about control. The calm before the storm. Most of these warriors were known to isolate themselves, fasting, training, and mentally breaking themselves down until fear didn't fit inside their skulls anymore. When the call to battle came, they were already halfway gone, mentally locked into a state that historians still struggle to describe. Their reputation wasn't entirely their fault. Villagers who saw them charge into battle, shirtless, roaring, eyes wide, probably assumed they'd gone mad. And in some ways, they had. They believed that pain didn't matter, that wounds were temporary, and that hesitation was death. You can almost imagine them on the field, axes glinting in the low sun, hair tangled, mouths open in silent defiance of everything mortal. But off the battlefield, they were surprisingly human. Most berserkers were farmers, fishermen, or craftsmen when they weren't fighting. They'd spend long winters carving wood, mending ships, or quietly drinking ale with the same hands that once split shields in half. The transition from fury to calm wasn't instant. It came in waves, a strange rhythm of violence and stillness that defined their lives. Their food was plain but heavy bread, salted fish, goats, milk, and porridge made from barley or oats. On rare days, when raids went well, they'd feast on roasted meat and honeyed ale. Eating was a ritual of gratitude, not luxury. Every bite meant survival. Every drink meant a pause between storms. And speaking of storms, the sea was their other battlefield. Those longships weren't just transport. They were symbols of power, carved with intricate designs meant to intimidate anyone who saw them glide through fog. The creak of the oars, the rhythmic chanting, and the slosh of cold seawater hitting wooden sides. It was the Viking soundtrack. You'd probably stand near the bow, eyes narrowed against the spray, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon was another village that would soon learn your name the hard way. Still, not every berserker fought for greed. Some did it for loyalty, to protect their kin, their land, or the fragile idea of legacy. In the North, dying well was more important than living long. You weren't measured by age, but by stories people told after you were gone. And when you came home, if you came home, the world around you felt different, quieter. The shouts of war would echo in your mind for days. You'd sit by the fire, your hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from memory. You'd sharpen your blade even when it didn't need it, because routine was the only thing that stopped you from thinking too much. Life as a berserker wasn't about endless rage. It was about learning to carry chaos without letting it consume you. And in that, maybe they weren't so different from us. Just louder, colder, and much, much hungrier. You sit there, watching the flames twist and whisper against the logs. The orange glow painting shadows across the longhouse walls. There's a hum of quiet conversation around you. Men sharpening blades, women sewing torn tunics. Someone gently plucking the strings of a lyre near the hearth. The sound is soft, steady, almost hypnotic. Life in this world isn't just about war. It's about waiting, And waiting for a Viking is often the hardest part. Outside, the wind howls like a warning, but inside, there's warmth. You take a deep breath. The air tastes of smoke and salt. There's always a trace of the sea, even here, miles inland. The sea defines everything. It's your road, your escape, your battlefield, and your grave, depending on the day. If you were a berserker by name, your training started long before your first raid. As a boy, you learned to fight, to hunt, to withstand cold, until your skin turned blue. Pain wasn't punishment, it was a teacher. The elders said a warrior who feared pain was a man already half dead. So you learned to live in discomfort, to treat hunger and exhaustion as familiar guests instead of enemies. Some historians think berserkers used rituals to prepare for battle. They'd fast for days, chant, or breathe in rhythmic bursts until the body entered a kind of trance, what modern people might call an adrenaline high. Others believe it came from discipline, not madness. You trained your body so ruthlessly that when battle began, it simply switched to instinct. No fear, no thought, just motion. But when the fighting stopped, that energy didn't just disappear. It lingered. Imagine your heart still pounding long after the clash of steel has faded, your muscles twitching like you're still fighting invisible ghosts. Some men never really came back from that edge. They'd wander into the woods alone, unable to settle, too restless for peace and too exhausted for more war. For those who could return home, the adjustment was strange. You'd sit in a village that felt too quiet. Children would stare at you like you were part human, part legend. The local blacksmith would nod at you in respect, but the baker's wife might whisper about your temper. You were both admired and feared, a walking contradiction in a world that loved strength but mistrusted it at the same time. And yet, for all the talk of rage and fury, berserkers also understood community. They weren't lone wolves, not really. They fought in groups, trusted each other with their lives, and shared everything from spoils to scars. Brotherhood wasn't a romantic idea, it was survival. A man who couldn't fight beside others didn't last long in a raid. During peacetime, you'd probably find yourself helping build a ship or repairing fences, pretending the quiet didn't bother you. But every sound, a creaking floorboard, a dog barking, thunder in the distance, could pull you right back into the memory of battle. You'd tighten your grip on whatever tool you were holding and remind yourself that this wasn't war anymore. There's an irony in that. The same ferocity that made you legendary also made it impossible to rest. People tell stories about berserkers charging into enemy lines, but they rarely talk about what came after: the stillness, the sleepless nights, the ghosts of men you'd rather not remember. You'd lie awake sometimes, staring at the rafters, listening to the crackle of the fire, and wonder whether peace was meant for men like you. Because peace, for a berserker, wasn't a reward. It was a test, one you didn't always pass. Morning comes slow in the north. The light doesn't rush in. It creeps pale and cold, slipping through the cracks in the longhouse roof. You wake to the sound of men stirring, boots scraping the floor, voices grumbling over breakfast. The smell of porridge and smoke fills the air. You stretch, bones popping like branches, and for a brief moment you forget the heaviness of what you are, a warrior waiting for another storm. The elders speak quietly near the fire. You catch bits of their words, talk of raids, alliances, and omens. The word berserker comes up more than once. They don't speak it casually. It's half respect, half fear. They say you carry the spirit of Odin's wildest warriors, that when battle comes, you don't fight with men, you fight beyond them. Some say that before a raid, berserkers performed rituals not just to summon courage, but to invite the wildness in. You'd strip down to the waist, smear ash across your skin, and call upon animal spirits, wolves, bears, or boars, to guide your fury. You'd growl, breathe deep, and let instinct replace reason. It wasn't just performance, it was transformation. And once the trance began, there was no turning back. Your pulse would quicken. The world around you would narrow to sound and motion. Fear became something distant, like watching it happen to someone else. When your axe rose, it felt lighter than air. When it fell, it cut through not just shields, but the silence inside your mind. Historians argue about whether the berserker frenzy was supernatural or psychological. Some think mushrooms or herbs were involved, though that's likely an exaggeration. Others believe it was just conditioning, men trained so brutally that they could summon rage on command. Either way, the results were the same. On the battlefield, you became something other than human. But again, what no one tells you is what happens after. When the battle ends and you're standing there, breath heavy, hands shaking, surrounded by silence, the rage doesn't fade easily. It leaves your body like smoke, slowly, painfully. You look down at what's been done, and for a moment you almost don't recognize your own hands. Back in the village, you're not celebrated with parades or songs. You're just expected to keep going, to eat, to drink, to work, as if none of it mattered. But the truth is, it did matter. You can feel it in every scar. You can see it in the faces of those who glance away too quickly when they meet your eyes. Sometimes you walk down to the shoreline, alone, letting the waves numb your thoughts. The sea is constant, indifferent, eternal. You stare at it for hours, the cold biting your skin, and you realize that the only time you ever truly feel peace is when you're standing between two worlds, the calm and the storm, the man and the beast. In those moments, you think about the other berserkers' men who lived and died in fury. Their names forgotten, their stories turned into myth. Maybe you'll become one of them someday. Maybe you already are. The line between legend and exhaustion is thin out here. And as the sun fades behind the hills, you return home once more, quiet, heavy, half lost in thought, because you know that when the next horn blows, when the next raid begins, you'll answer it, not because you want to, but because you were made to. The night before a raid was never peaceful, no matter how calm the camp looked from the outside. There was an unease that hung in the air, like smoke, that strange mix of anticipation and dread that only men who've seen battle can recognize. Around the fire, some of your brothers sharpened axes, others whispered prayers to gods who never promised mercy. You sat quietly, tracing the notches on your weapon's handle. Each one a reminder of a man who didn't live to see another sunrise. You never spoke much before a raid. Words had weight, and out here, even breath could betray you. Instead, you listened to the creaking of the wooden shields stacked nearby, to the crackle of the fire, to the rhythm of your heartbeat. It was always the same, slow, steady, patient, until the moment it wasn't. Someone started humming an old tune, a war song, low and deep, meant to summon courage and scare away fear. Others joined in, their voices merging into something haunting and ancient. The melody wasn't beautiful, but it was real. It carried the weight of generations who'd lived and died the same way, and somehow, it made the night feel less endless. You thought about home, the simple things, the smoke curling from your mother's hearth, the sound of waves slapping the shore near your village, the soft creak of your father's old boat. It was strange how those memories always came before violence, as if your mind needed to remind you that you'd once known peace. When the chieftain finally spoke, his voice cut through the air like a blade. He didn't give a grand speech. He didn't talk about glory or destiny. He simply said, "Tomorrow, we take what is owed." That was enough. Men nodded, stood, and dispersed into the shadows, each lost in his own silence. You lay on your back, staring at the faint stars above, and tried to rest, but sleep rarely came. The earth beneath you felt too alive, the night too aware. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, every rustle like movement. It wasn't fear, it was readiness. You could almost feel the weight of your axe against your palm, waiting. And when dawn finally bled across the horizon, pale and cold, you rose without a word. The camp stirred to life around you, men strapping on armor, adjusting belts, testing their blades. You could see the firelight flickering across their faces, reflecting both exhaustion and something else. The quiet certainty that some of them wouldn't come back. You smeared mud across your arms, drew faint lines on your chest with ash. It wasn't about superstition. It was a ritual, a way of separating the man from the monster you needed to become. You took a slow breath, felt the tremor in your chest, and let it fade. As the longboats slid into the water, oars creaking, you looked once toward the rising sun. There was no triumph in it, just inevitability. The kind that every berserker understood, that your path had already been carved long ago. In the stories told by firelight, in the echoes of drums and gods, the sea mist hit your face, cold and sharp. You gripped the oar, muscles tensing. The raid was near, and as the wind picked up and the coastline began to shrink behind you, something ancient stirred in your blood, that quiet, dangerous calm before the storm, when the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The sea was restless that morning, its waves curling like gray claws under the pale northern light. The longboats cut through the water with steady rhythm, each oar dipping in unison, the sound of wood and ocean beating like a giant heart. Salt stung your lips, and the cold gnawed at your bones, but no one complained. It wasn't discomfort that bothered a berserker. It was silence, the kind that makes a man's thoughts grow too loud. You could hear the low grumble of men around you, fragments of old songs, half-whispered jokes, and quiet prayers to Odin and Thor. Some spat into the sea, offering to whatever waited beyond the waves. Others kept their eyes fixed forward, lost in thoughts of gold, or glory, or simply survival. Everyone rowed, because stopping meant weakness, and weakness didn't belong in this world. The horizon was just a smear of gray, until, slowly, it broke a sliver of land, dark and jagged. The place had no name to you yet, just another coastline, another cluster of huts and walls built by men who thought they were safe. You didn't hate them. Hate was too personal. This was simply life. Take, survive, repeat. As the longboats neared the shallows, you could see the flicker of movement on shore. Farmers, maybe, or shepherds, running to warn others. The chieftain didn't shout orders. He didn't need to. Every man knew his part. Shields rose, axes were gripped tighter, and the world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. When the first boots hit the wet sand, time seemed to dissolve. The line between man and beast blurred. You ran without thought, driven by something primal, not rage exactly, but release. The sound of steel meeting wood, of voices shouting in panic, filled the air like thunder. Smoke began to rise. The raid had begun. You fought the way you always did, with precision disguised as chaos. A swing, a step, a twist. It wasn't art, but it was instinct honed over years. You could feel your pulse slow, even as the world around you burned faster. That strange calm, again, the one people mistook for madness. And in the middle of it all, you felt the shift, that moment, when the berserker took over, when the world narrowed to the swing of your axe, the crunch of bone, the hiss of breath, when pain vanished and time stretched, every heartbeat stretching into forever. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. You weren't just a man anymore. You were the storm they whispered about in foreign villages. By the time it was over, the beach was quiet again. The air was thick with smoke and salt. Men walked among the wreckage, collecting what could be carried: food, weapons, trinkets, sometimes people. You sat on a rock, watching the tide roll in, washing away footprints and blood alike. No one spoke much afterward. There was no need to glorify what was done. The dead didn't care for stories, and the living already understood the price. You looked down at your hands, still trembling, still stained. The berserker state was fading, leaving behind that hollow stillness that always followed. You'd survived, again. But survival, you knew, was never the same as peace. That night, as the longboats drifted back toward open sea, the stars broke through the clouds for the first time. You leaned against the side, listening to the creak of the wood and the gentle slap of waves. For a moment, the world was quiet again. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder how long a man can live between the storm and the stillness. The sea had a rhythm to it, one you could almost breathe with if you stopped thinking long enough. The creak of oars, the slap of water against the hull, the distant murmur of men half asleep or lost in memory. You stared into the dark horizon, where sea and sky blurred into one endless gray, and thought of home, or what passed for home these days. Home wasn't a place for a berserker. It was a fleeting thing, A hall full of smoke and laughter. 1 month, a cold ruin the next. The villagers came and went, but the stories stayed. Stories of men like you, half feared, half revered. They'd talk about how you bit your shield before battle, how you felt no pain, how you were blessed by Odin himself. It sounded glorious when the skalds sang it. It always did. But between the songs and the silence, there was the truth, the fits, the tremors that came days after battle. The night terrors where you woke, gasping, hands reaching for an axe that wasn't there. Some men called it the curse of the wolf. Others said it was the price for touching divine madness. You just called it exhaustion. The truth was, berserkers weren't born, they were made. And it wasn't through rituals or spells or meat-soaked visions. It was through years of brutality, of being pushed past a point where ordinary men stopped. You'd seen too much, done too much. The mind had to protect itself somehow, even if that meant tearing itself apart in the process. Still, the life had its rewards. When the raids went well, there were feasts. Endless meat and ale, laughter echoing through the longhouse as fires burned bright. The chieftain's men would boast of their kills, showing off silver arm rings and battle scars. Someone would strum a lyre, and for a while, it almost felt like joy. You'd sit near the back, where the shadows flickered softer, your cup full but untouched. The mead never tasted the same after battle. Too sweet, too alive. You'd watch the others drink until their words slurred, their laughter turning wild. And in that blur of noise and heat, you'd catch glimpses of something else, the old gods. Maybe lingering in the smoke, amused by how men celebrated destruction as though it were creation. And then came the quiet again. The next morning, the longhouse smelled of sweat and ash. Some men were still asleep in corners, others already outside sharpening blades for the next voyage. The world didn't pause long enough to mourn or reflect. There was always another village, another coastline, another promise of silver. You wondered sometimes if any of it mattered, if the gods truly cared, or if they watched you all like pieces in some long-forgotten game. Maybe that's why berserkers fought so fiercely, not for faith, not even for glory, but for that fleeting moment when the noise inside finally matched the noise outside, when everything made sense for just a heartbeat. You reached down and traced the scars along your forearm, each one a memory you'd rather forget. They looked almost like runes now, carved into you by time itself. You weren't sure if they told a story or a warning, maybe both. The waves grew calmer as the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine from distant shores. A new land, perhaps another raid, another chance to lose yourself again in that strange, intoxicating chaos that only the berserker's path could offer. The chieftain's voice rose suddenly, breaking the stillness, barking orders to prepare the oars. The men stirred, shaking off sleep and silence alike. You took one last look at the horizon, its edge glowing faintly with dawn, and for just a second, you almost smiled. Because for all its brutality, for all its madness, this was life, harsh, fleeting, and raw. The kind of life that burned fast and left nothing behind but stories whispered around firelight long after. The sea had claimed your name. The air was thick with salt and mist as the ship neared the new coast. The oars moved in quiet rhythm, blades cutting the water like a slow heartbeat. You could smell the earth long before you saw it, the damp rot of trees, the faint musk of smoke from some distant settlement that didn't yet know it was being watched. The men around you leaned forward, eyes glinting in the dim light, hungry not just for silver, but for the certainty that came with conquest. When the keel scraped the shallows, they moved with rehearsed silence. You'd done this so many times that it barely felt like a decision anymore, more like instinct, something your body did while your mind drifted somewhere far away. The boat slid onto the sand, men wading through the surf, shields ready. The world was nothing but breath and heartbeat now. And then it began. By the time the sun rose high, the raid was over. Smoke curled lazily from burning thatch, and gulls wheeled overhead, drawn by the scent of ruin. The spoils were small this time, a few chests, a few terrified captives, some half-melted silver, but that wasn't what most of them had come for anyway. It was the rush, the proof that they still could. You sat on a fallen log, wiping ash from your hands. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving that hollow, echoing stillness that always followed. The men were laughing again, dividing spoils, arguing over whose axe had done the most work. The world seemed to hum quietly around you, as if it were holding its breath. You felt the tremor in your hand start, the one that always came after the rage. It wasn't fear. It was the body remembering that it was human again. Later, when the fires burned down and the captives were gone, traded, ransomed, or worse, you found yourself standing by the shore, looking at the ship that had brought you here. The tide lapped at your boots, gentle, almost forgiving. You thought about how many shores you'd stood on like this, how many faces had blurred together. The life of a berserker wasn't about meaning. It was about motion, always forward, always searching for something you couldn't name. Back home, if you could call it that, the skalds would already be composing songs. They'd speak of gods guiding your blades, of rage as holy fire. They wouldn't sing about the shaking hands, or the eyes that never stopped darting at shadows. They wouldn't mention the nights where you woke up gasping, heart pounding like the drums of battle you swore you'd left behind. You'd seen young men come and go, wide-eyed, eager, desperate to prove themselves in battle. They thought being a berserker meant power, freedom. They didn't understand the cost. The way the line between man and beast blurred until you couldn't tell which one was winning. You'd seen some never come back from it, lost to their own fury, burned out like embers left in rain. Still, part of you envied them. The simplicity of it. To throw yourself into the storm without thought, without question, to forget the faces, the blood, the cold silence after the screams faded. You used to believe the gods spoke through that fury. Now you weren't so sure. Maybe they just watched. The sea breeze picked up, carrying the faint sound of waves breaking farther down the coast. You turned toward the noise, squinting into the distance. The horizon seemed endless again, a reminder that the world was vast and indifferent. You'd keep sailing, keep fighting, keep pretending the rage meant something. Because stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant remembering. You adjusted your cloak against the wind, the fabric rough against your scarred skin. The ship would sail again soon. There would be another raid, another haul full of laughter and lies. And you'd play your part, same as always. The berserker who felt no pain, no fear, no doubt. And maybe, if you were lucky, you'd even believe it for a little while. The journey home was quiet. The ocean stretched endlessly around the long ship, dark and glittering under the fading light. Every few moments, the oars dipped into the water with a slow, steady rhythm, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the low murmurs of men half asleep. You leaned against the side, cloak pulled tight, watching the sun sink behind a bank of clouds. The wind was cold enough to sting, but after what you'd seen on land, the cold felt clean, almost comforting. The raid had been another success, at least by the usual standards. The chieftain would be pleased. The jarls would nod and praise Odin's favor. The men would drink themselves into oblivion and swear the gods had smiled on them again. But as the waves lapped against the hull, you couldn't shake the feeling that each victory felt smaller than the last. The gold, the songs, the fleeting glory, all of it seemed to fade a little faster every time. Someone nearby began humming, a low, broken tune. A sea shanty, half forgotten, passed down from one voyage to another. It drifted through the air like smoke, wrapping itself around the creak of the ship and the sigh of the wind. The men were relaxed now, their fury spent, their faces soft in the twilight. For all their talk of gods and destiny, they looked almost peaceful, like farmers coming home from harvest. You closed your eyes and let the rhythm carry you. The salt in the air, the faint temps of pitch and wood, the heavy silence between breaths, it all blended together, until you couldn't tell if you were awake or dreaming. You thought about the old seers, the ones who claimed every warrior's path was written long before his first battle. If that were true, yours must have been scrawled in blood and smoke, with no end in sight. By the time you reached the fjord, the night sky was painted with stars. The village fires twinkled on the shore, little golden dots against the dark cliffs. The dogs began barking before the first or touched the shallows. Children ran down to greet the ships, their laughter sharp against the calm. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the war fading into the background, replaced by the warmth of home. You climbed out, boots sinking into wet sand, and breathed in the smell of pine and hearth smoke. Familiar faces greeted you, wives, brothers, old comrades who hadn't sailed this time. Someone handed you a drinking horn, the mead sweet and heavy on your tongue. The chieftain clapped you on the shoulder, booming his praise, but his words barely reached you. The hall roared with laughter, the fire crackled, the music began, but it all felt distant, muffled, as though you were listening through water. You knew this feeling well, the emptiness after battle, the strange calm that wasn't peace, the way the mind reached for something to fill the space where rage used to be. You looked around the hall, at the shining shields, the carved benches, the faces blurred by drink, and wondered how long any of it could last. The old scout began reciting the saga of an ancestor, voice deep and measured. The hall quieted to listen. His words painted a story of glory, of gods granting victory, of heroes dying with smiles on their lips. The men around you nodded, eyes glazed, caught between belief and exhaustion. You listened too, though you'd heard it all before. You always did. Somewhere inside, a part of you still wanted to believe it, that the rage had purpose, that the pain meant something, that the gods were still watching. But as the firelight danced across the wooden beams and the wind howled outside, another thought crept in, quiet, unwelcome, but persistent. Maybe the gods weren't guiding you. Maybe they were just bored. You finished your drink, the mead thick and warm, and set the horn aside. Around you, laughter flared again. Someone began another song, off-key but loud. The hall came alive once more. You smiled faintly, not because you felt like it, but because it was easier that way. Outside, the waves crashed softly against the shore, pulling the tide back into the endless dark. Later that night, when the hall had gone quiet and the last of the mead had been drained, you slipped outside. The cold hit you instantly, that sharp, northern chill that burned your lungs but made you feel alive again. The stars overhead were blinding, scattered across the black sky like shards of ice. You could hear the sea not far off, rolling against the rocks in that slow, endless rhythm that only the north could make. You stood there for a while, staring out at the fjord, the moonlight glinting on the longships pulled up on shore. Each one told a story. Every plank, every iron nail, every streak of dried salt on the hull spoke of raids and storms and lost men. You thought of the faces that didn't make it back this time, the ones who'd fallen to a stray arrow or vanished beneath the waves. No songs would be sung for them. No skald would carve their names into legend. They'd simply drift into memory, swallowed by the fog and the sea. You took a slow breath and let it out in a cloud. The air smelled of pine and ash and something older, that faint metallic timps of cold iron and fire. It reminded you of the forge, of the clang of hammers shaping weapons long before battle. You'd stood there once too, as a boy, watching sparks fly like tiny stars, while your father told you that steel remembers its maker. You used to think he meant it as poetry. Now, you weren't so sure. Inside, you could still hear the muffled sounds of life, someone snoring, someone laughing too loud in their sleep, the crackle of the dying fire. It was peaceful in its own way, but also heavy, a kind of peace that carried weight. You walked toward the shore, boots crunching on the frost. The tide was out, revealing black rocks slick with seaweed. You crouched, picked up a smooth stone, and turned it over in your hand. Cold, solid, unchanged. A gull cried somewhere overhead, breaking the stillness for a moment. You smiled faintly, thinking how even the birds never seemed to sleep here. Everything in this land was awake, alert, as if it shared the same restless blood as its people. You understood that feeling all too well, that itch that wouldn't fade, the quiet hum of energy even when the body was still. The berserker inside you, the one that woke when the drums started and the blades flashed, was quiet now. But you could still feel him, waiting, breathing just beneath the surface. You never truly left him behind. No one ever did. He was part of you, carved into bone and soul, like the runes on a warrior's blade. You sat down on a rock, staring at the black water. Somewhere in the distance, the horizon began to pale, the faintest hint of dawn creeping in. The north was like that. Always cold, always dark, but never without the promise of light. You thought about what tomorrow would bring. Another day of mending ships, sharpening swords, pretending that the next raid would be different. It wouldn't be, of course, it never was, but that was the life the gods, or fate, had handed you. The cold crept deeper into your hands, but you didn't move. You just watched the sky shift, slow and silent. The world felt endless, but somehow very small at the same time. You wondered if men like you ever really left a mark. If, in 100 years, anyone would remember your name. Maybe they'd carve it into a runestone. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe, like so many others, you'd simply fade, a whisper in some saga told by a drunk skald on a winter night. For now, though it didn't matter, you were alive. The sea was calling again, quiet but insistent. And deep inside, beneath the scars and the silence, you knew you'd answer it, just as you always had. By the time the first light broke across the horizon, painting the fjord in that cold silver glow, you were already back on your feet. The village was stirring. Soft footsteps, the clang of iron, the low murmur of voices, too tired for conversation, but too restless to stay quiet. Smoke curled up from the longhouse chimneys, thin and pale in the morning air. It smelled like fish oil, ash, and the faint sweetness of peat smoke. It was the scent of home, if one could ever call this place that. You walked past the blacksmith's forge where the old man, half blind and half frozen, was already at work. He nodded once, without looking up, hammer rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed older than both of you. The sparks looked like fireflies caught in slow motion. You envied him sometimes. His wars were with metal, not men. Steel didn't scream or bleed. It just bent, or broke, or held strong, depending on how you treated it. By the docks, the longships rocked gently in the tide, their carved dragon heads facing the open water like they were waiting for the next excuse to leave. You ran your hand along one of the hulls. The wood was damp and scarred, but it still felt alive. Every dent, every rough edge was a memory. A frozen river, a monastery on fire, a scream carried off by the wind. One of the younger men called out to you, a boy, really, barely old enough to grow a beard. He wanted to know when the next raid would be. You looked at him and saw yourself years ago, full of impatience, full of that strange hunger for something you couldn't name. You told him soon, though you both knew that soon meant whenever the sea allowed it. The north didn't bend to men's plans. As the sun climbed higher, people began their chores, mending nets, feeding animals, trading gossip about whose child had a fever and whose goat had gone missing. Ordinary life continued, quietly and stubbornly, even after death and glory had done their part. That was the real secret of the North. It wasn't the battles or the gods that kept it alive. It was this, the slow, cold persistence of everyday survival. You stopped by the healer's hut, mostly out of habit. Inside it smelled of herbs and smoke and the faint metallic temps of dried blood. The woman who worked there, old, stooped, and sharpened, glanced up at you and muttered that you looked worse than usual. You told her it was just the cold. She didn't believe you, but she didn't press. She never did. She handed you a cup of something bitter that burned going down. You drank it anyway. When you stepped back outside, the air felt clearer. The sky was brighter, though the wind still bit through your cloak. You walked toward the cliff path overlooking the fjord. From there, the world spread out, mountains to the east, ocean to the west, and that endless expanse of gray-blue in between. Somewhere out there were new lands, new battles, new songs waiting to be sung. And somewhere else, maybe, the gods were watching, amused at the smallness of human ambition. You thought about what it meant to be a berserker. People liked to whisper about the rage, the madness, the unstoppable fury in battle. They thought it was something mystical, something gifted by Odin himself. But it wasn't magic. It was something simpler. It was surrender. A letting go so complete that you stopped being a man and became something else, an echo of the storm, a vessel for chaos. And when it was over, you were just empty. That emptiness had become familiar. You carried it the way others carried scars, quietly, permanently. You didn't talk about it because no one really wanted to hear. They wanted legends, not truth, and so you let them believe whatever made them feel brave. The wind picked up again, rattling the dry grass, carrying the faint sound of waves crashing below. You closed your eyes for a moment, breathing it in. The salt, the cold, the stillness. Somewhere far off, a raven called, one note, low and hollow. It felt like an answer to a question you hadn't asked. You opened your eyes, looked out at the sea, and felt it again, that quiet pull in your chest, that whisper that said there was always one more voyage, one more battle, one more story left to live. And as much as you told yourself you were done, you knew the truth. You'd go. You always would. Because that's what a berserker does. He endures. He fights. And when the world finally grows silent, he keeps walking, as if the wind itself still has somewhere to be. By late afternoon, the sun had softened into that pale, low light that made everything look like it was fading into a dream. The shadows stretched long over the fjord, the water turning to sheets of molten gray. The village quieted, too. Children's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere near the mead hall. But most of the adults had already retreated indoors, sharpening tools, patching sails, or sitting in that familiar silence that comes after too many winters and too few harvests. You stood on the rocky ledge above the village, where the old wooden totems of the gods had been left to weather and crack. Odin, Thor, Freya, their carved faces now softened by rain and time. You'd seen men kneel here before raids, whispering prayers that were half hope, half fear. You'd done the same once. Now, you just looked at them with the quiet indifference of someone who's already lived through too much to beg for mercy. Below you, the waves lapped rhythmically against the shore. You could hear the creak of a ship's hull shifting with the tide, the faint rattle of a chain, the distant bleat of goats. It was the same song the North always sang, steady, cold, eternal. You thought about the old berserkers, the ones sung about in sagas, their names stretched into legend. Men who supposedly bit through shields, who ran naked into battle, who were said to be invincible. But when you looked back at all the faces you'd known, you saw something else, not invincibility, just exhaustion dressed up as courage. It wasn't rage that kept a berserker fighting, it was the inability to stop. Your mind wandered, as it often did these days, to the people you'd left behind. There had been a woman once, dark hair, quiet smile, the kind that haunted you. Without trying, you remembered her hands, rough from work, soft in rare moments. You'd promised you'd come back, and in a way, you did, but not the same. None of you ever came back the same. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain. You pulled your cloak tighter and sat on a flat stone, tracing the cracks in it with your thumb. Somewhere in the back of your head, you wondered if this was how the old warriors felt when their strength began to fade. That strange, almost peaceful understanding that the world would go on without them. The next generation would rise, swing their axes, carve their stories into wood and memory. The songs would change names, but the melody would stay the same. Behind you, the door of the mead hall opened, and warm orange light spilled onto the ground. Someone called your name, not loud, just enough to remind you that life was still happening. Even if it felt like it was slipping quietly past. You didn't answer right away. You just sat there, letting the cold settle around you, like an old friend. The sky was turning to slate now, clouds rolling in from the west. A drizzle began to fall, light, steady, almost rhythmic. The drops gathered on your armor and cloak, catching the last bits of fading light. Each one felt like a heartbeat, soft but insistent. You closed your eyes and listened to it. It struck you then that this was what peace looked like for men like you. Not grand endings, not songs sung in mead halls, not the favor of gods. Just this, a quiet moment on a cold rock, the smell of rain, the weight of memories, and the faint sound of waves that didn't care whether you lived or died. You finally stood, joints aching, and took one last look at the horizon. The world was gray, endless, indifferent, and somehow, that was enough. You turned toward the mead hall, the glow of its fire flickering like a promise of warmth you weren't sure you deserved. But you went anyway, because the night was coming, and even a berserker had to rest. Inside the mead hall, the air was heavy with smoke and warmth. The flicker of torches painted the wooden walls in shifting amber light, and the smell of roasted meat and pine pitch filled every breath. Conversations murmured low, steady, like the hum of an old song everyone knew, but no one sang out loud anymore. You slipped into a corner, the way you always did, far enough from the fire to watch without being watched. A few of the younger warriors sat near the hearth, loud with laughter, their cheeks flushed with drink. They spoke of raids and glories that hadn't yet happened, each story more exaggerated than the last. You could almost see yourself in them. Years ago, before the scars, before the weight of too many winters settled on your shoulders, you smiled faintly, not in mockery, but in quiet understanding. The stories were always bigger than the men who lived them. That was how the world kept turning. A bard started playing softly in the corner, the strings of his lyre trembling under his fingers. The song wasn't about heroes or gods this time. It was about home, about the fields that never yielded enough grain, the ships that never returned, the faces that never smiled again. The words drifted through the hall like smoke, curling around your thoughts until you weren't sure whether you were listening or remembering. You found yourself tracing the rim of your cup, the rough wood catching slightly on the scars of your fingers. Someone passed by and clapped your shoulder, a gesture of respect, maybe gratitude. You nodded without looking up. The truth was, you didn't want gratitude, you just wanted quiet. Outside, the rain had become a steady curtain. You could hear it drumming gently on the roof, a sound that drowned out the noise of the hall, until it all faded into something soft, almost like a heartbeat. You leaned back against the wall and let your eyes drift half closed. The warmth of the fire reached you in uneven waves, and for a moment, you could almost imagine you were back home, not in this smoky hall, not surrounded by ghosts and armor, but somewhere simpler. A small hut by the sea, the smell of fish and salt, someone humming a tune while the tide came in. The bard's song faded, replaced by the crackle of the fire. No one clapped, no one spoke. It was as if everyone was caught in the same shared silence, that unspoken understanding that came only when you realized life wasn't about battles or fame or even survival. It was about the small, fleeting warmths that appeared between the cold stretches of time. You stood quietly, setting your empty cup on the table, and walked toward the door. The wood groaned as you pushed it open, and the night air hit you like a reminder, cold, clean, infinite. The rain washed down your face, tracing lines like tears that didn't belong to sorrow. You breathed in deeply, tasting the salt, the smoke, the earth, everything that made this world both brutal and beautiful. You looked out across the village one last time, the dim lights flickering behind window shutters, the ships tied and rocking gently in the bay, the dark shapes of the mountains standing like old gods watching over it all. You thought about how far you'd come, how much you'd lost, and how strange it was that even now, with everything fading, it still felt enough. And so, you let the night take you, not in battle, not in fire or glory, but in stillness. The rain fell, the waves sighed, and the world kept breathing, utterly unchanged. You were just another story now, carried quietly in the wind that whispered over the fjord. And somewhere, far away, someone might one day tell it, not as a legend of rage or strength, but as a soft memory of a man who once lived fiercely and learned, at last, how to rest.